much for being a part of this project. And we will start the interview with just a little information about your background.
Okay.
So could you let me know where were you born and when were you born and just, your setup in your early years?
Okay, so I was born, my name is Jonathan Addleton. I was born in Mareeha, Pakistan, June 27, 1957, at Kashmir Point. There's a house there called Rock Edge, and that's where the house where my parents were living that summer, and that's where I was born.
And when was this?
1957, June 1957.
If I can know a little bit about your parents, what is their background, where were they born, and their names maybe even?
Yeah. So my father was Hubert Addleton, born in November 1929. He passed away, I guess, about 18 months ago. He would have been 94 actually. He passed away at the age of 92. My mother is still living, Betty Addleton. She was born in 1931. Both of them they didn't know each other till they were in high school or even young adults, but they lived in rural middle Georgia. You're talking about the 1930s. You're talking about the Depression. My father was one of 14 children. My mother was one of 8. Both at the younger end of the family, but especially for my father, Depression-era family, rural kind of childhood. My mother used to say they were as poor as church mice. My father remembers, basically in agriculture, just working with a mule. They didn't have, they didn't have tractors and stuff like that. It was basically plowing behind a mule is his memory. They were the first. My father was the first in his family to finish high school, go on to college. He had this, I guess it's a spiritual calling that he really wanted to serve somewhere in the world. Asia was a huge attraction for him. So he was a pastor. He was a translator. I guess a missionary is what he was for most of his life, and very at home in Pakistan. We maybe talk a bit more about it, but they basically in 1956, I guess doing the math, my mother would have been 25, my father was 27. They came out on a freighter to Pakistan. They were assigned to Upper Sindh. My father worked in Sindhi, actually, not in Urdu, learned Sindhi quite well, but much of their working life was spent in Sindh, first in Ratodero, then in Shikarpur, then in Hyderabad, and I guess at the end of his working life here, he was in Karachi. So I guess it was gradually moving from a smaller, almost a village like Ratodero, to at the end of the time it was in Karachi is where they finished their time in Pakistan.
So your father does know Sindhi. He knew Sindhi, right?
Yeah. So this is interesting for your program. They were, and this is obviously we're all creatures of our time. This is the 1950s, Second World War. America's engaging with the world in a way it hadn't before. For some people that might mean diplomatic service or military or whatever, but in this case it was missionary service. That was the reason that he came here. But there were eight couples from the U.S. that came out at the same time. 4 of them learned Urdu first, and 4 of them learned Sindhi first. And my father was in the group that learned Sindhi. And the reality is, every one of those 4 families, or the father and the mother, that learned Sindhi went on to learn Urdu. Nobody that learned Urdu first went on to learn Sindhi. And it was because, Urdu's the national language. I mean, actually, as a first language, Sindhi is probably spoken more often than Urdu, but it's the national language. And so once you had mastered Urdu, you could communicate anywhere in the country. Whereas if you learned Sindhi, your communication was just confined to Sindh. And so the incentive was to learn Urdu so you could communicate across the country. There's also the simple reality that, honestly, Sindhi is a harder language than Urdu, and so it's easier to move from a hard language to an easier language than the opposite direction.
Did you ever pick up Sindhi from your parents?
My life, they lived in Sindh. My father lived there pretty much year-round. My life was more in Murray in the mountains going to school, so I had my summer vacations. I can understand perhaps more Sindhi than one might realize. I think it's a beautiful language. When you hear it, it's very distinctively Sindhi, and it's almost musical in some ways. And I picked up a few phrases, Tava Sindhi Marno, this kind of thing, and from my father. But my father was serious about it. I mean, much of his life was devoted to translation work. He with a missionary colleague, he developed a Sindhi language textbook. And his son, who actually is an academic, as a professor, turned that into a really nice, attractive printed book, and it's available on Amazon. And what Dan Brown, not the Dan Brown the novelist, but Dan Brown the academic, has told me is that what happens is you get these expat Sindhis who some of them from the went to Australia or India or anywhere else at partition in 47, but others that went later, that the second generation, in order to try to reconnect with Cindy, are ordering this off Amazon. And it's a good book. It's basically basic Sindhi for English
It
speakers.
must help with the culture and language preservation. It is becoming a tool.
I think it does. He worked with a professor called Dr. Norman Zaidi, who was a linguistic professor at University of Chicago. In some ways, it's part of his legacy as the Sindhi language textbook. He also did translation work. The translation, especially when it comes to scripture, is a very long process. It's not one person sitting in an office translating. Mm-hmm. It's a committee process, a review. He Sarvar was the Sindhi scholar he associated with, who was they worked together, became a colleague and a friend. But basically, when they were around in the 50s, the Sindhi translations were of the Zabur and the Injil, and basically the scripture, the Christian scriptures, were quite archaic because they were the late 1800s. So the intent, working with what's called the United Bible Society, which is based in New York, was to do a translation that they call common language. Sindhi changes in 60 or 70 years. Also, the Sindhi at that time, I think, drew quite heavily on Hindu tradition and this kind of thing, and of course, Sindhi changed in the intervening years. Anyway, be that as it may, he basically worked with the Sindhi scholar, and together they did the translation. And when they do this, it's line by line. It's very, very methodical. And then, of course, they would meet in a committee, and even some of the basic words, which word to use. So yeah, I think the question was, of course, did I ever pick up Sindhi? I didn't pick up Sindhi to freely speak. I did understand it to some extent, but I do view my father as my mother to some extent, but it was really my father who worked in the language and did translation.
And he did a lot,
which is the ultimate test of it. I mean, some of these great classics, Pilgrim's Progress, which actually appealed to people. He worked on the Sindhi translation of that as well. So he did do some other kinds of translation too. So.
What is your earliest memory of living in Pakistan?
So, I really, I was born in 1957, and in 1960, my parents went back to the States for 1 year. And if I'm honest with myself, I think the earliest, and you think about when children have memories, I don't know your earliest memory, but 1960, Christmas 1960, I'm 3.5 years old, and this time we're in the States. We live in a sort of a somewhat rural setting. And it's the classic childhood memory that you go out with your dad and your siblings to get a Christmas tree, and so that's what I remember. So that was would have been December 1961. In July 1961, this is December 1960. In July 61, we returned to Pakistan. So I would have been 4 years old, and I just have vague memories of the house in Murray. And by this time, actually, now that you said about it, earliest memory, wow. It must have been in Shikarpur before I went to boarding school. So I was living in Shikarpur. It was called the Scout Bungalow, which my parents were renting outside town, a sort of old-style house. And my father had picked up our Land Rover and driven it up from Karachi. And I woke up before the rest of the family, and I looked out the window, and there was our Land Rover, which, if I might say, took us many, many hundreds of miles in the next few years around Sindh. But, maybe it's a boy's memory that you look at and, wow, that's our car. So that was my first memory.
In Pakistan, you studied here, right? So maybe any early memories from school life, from your early years at the Christian school in Murray? Yeah,
so Murray, of course, is that tradition. There's St. Denny's, and there's the Convent of Jesus and Mary, and there's Lawrence College. And then the Murray Christian School, small college, but part of that tradition, I guess, and it was a boarding school. People nowadays, at least in the U.S., are shocked that my parents sent me to boarding school when I was 6 years old. They say, how could they have done it? So the earlier memories are actually my father. You actually had to be 6.5, so I couldn't start in the fall. So it was halfway through first grade that my father took me up to boarding school and dropped me off. And one of the things for our own kids is I often say that if you're privileged enough to be able to give your kids a sense of beauty from a young age, then you're lucky, you're fortunate. And for me, I feel privileged because I did have that sense of beauty. Murray has changed. arguably people might say, oh God, all the the too many
Industrialization has
hotels
got
and
into it,
all the buildings, and boy, next earthquake that Murray's going to slide down the hill, and you wonder what's going to happen then. But the reality is, when you look beyond the buildings and the hotels and all that, it's beautiful. You're looking toward Kashmir, you're looking toward the Pir Panjal Range. The Himalayas are the Himalayas, and so those are the early memories. And I think if you think about it, some memories for some people are about family relationships, some are about a trip to the countryside or the farm or something. For me, it's probably really looking at those magnificent mountains, which is an image that stays with you the rest of your life.
So, like, when you were going to boarding school, it must have provided you with an environment to immerse in the language and culture of the people there. I'm not sure how diverse boarding school was in terms of the ethnicities of people there.
Yeah.
But how did that experience affect your language use and cultural identity even?
Yeah. Well, early on, it was probably more of an American presence, although with the passage of time, we did get students from Norway and Germany, and even from... this was more after my time that the Koreans began to enroll. There were some Pakistani students, honestly, mostly the children of medical doctors at some of the the Christian hospitals that Taxila and UCH here as well, and other kind of schools. So that was part of the setup. In that sense, I mean, English was absolutely predominant, and I did take Urdu lessons. I did take French lessons. I will say there's a handful of my classmates that were really, really good. One of them is, I'll mention his name, Joel DeHart, who he was just very good with languages. His Urdu was wonderful. He learned Pashto, and he traveled. He was sort of drawn to the KPP and even Afghanistan, and he was just good with languages. Another guy called Paul Stock, who works in Sindh. He works in the Sindhi language. He works in the tribal languages in Darparkar and those places. Those are two. There are a handful of others of my generation that were exceptional, and I admired them, and maybe I could say I envied them. I wasn't in that league, but I did take Urdu. We did do Urdu for shopping in Jikka Gully and going into Murray. Different times we hitchhiked. People are sometimes surprised as a 16-year-old hitchhiked from essentially Murray to Peshawar, which I don't think almost nobody would do it now, but certainly a foreigner would be a little bit intimidated by that. And so I used the language in that context, but I didn't use it in a literary kind of way. At first, I was a little surprised when the invite came to, you can participate in this, because I mean, probably you're in that category as well, that you grew up with some English, but of course you also had Urdu, and maybe there was some Punjabi in the mix as well. I was exposed to those languages. Maybe it's a factor of history. Maybe it's I don't know if it's a good fortune or a privilege or what, but English gets you around, so you kind of do it. So again, I think of that generation, we look back and we think, well, maybe our elders should have done more to, maybe not just the 45 minutes of Urdu language, but maybe they should have done some more introductions to the language.
Other local languages
Local languages as well, yeah. But anyway, we're all creatures of our times, and I do feel, I use Urdu now, and a lot of it came back. I tell people, मैं पाकिस्तान में पैदा हुआ, बचपन मैंने मरी में पढ़ा, काफ़ी साल हुई, लेकिन अब तक मुझे कुछ उर्दू आती है. So I still, even after all these years, I still do it. And coming back, I've been back 3 years now. I don't have time to study it, but my comprehension is really quite good, and I'm in many environments where I hear the language spoken and I understand it pretty much. 90% of it, government stuff or education or even students talking or whatever. So that's part's good. I do speak sometimes. I don't know. I try to speak when I can, but I'm also acutely aware of the mistakes. So there's sort of a self-conscious kind of. I'm making mistakes, and I don't know, maybe some people...
Especially with native speakers when you're communicating with them.
That's the irony, is that, and you got it right. what it's like is that when you're... and also in Pakistan, you're sitting here and you're talking to somebody you haven't met before, and you quickly establish, okay, I know the language this well. This person knows... I know their language to some extent. They know my language better than I know their language. So even if I somewhat know the language, or even medium-sized know the language, the communication becomes the language of the two people who speaks both languages the best. And I mean, maybe it's a credit to Pakistan or whatever that, or I mean, our campus here. I mean, there's just wonderful, lots of English speakers, but so you kind of revert to those languages. I remember this is a funny story, I suppose, but some American was just talking about, oh, Benazir Bhutto's English is so wonderful. And I felt like saying, well, look, she grew up with English. I mean, but people outside Pakistan don't necessarily realize the bilingual aspect of certain Pakistani households that grow up speaking Urdu and English. And correct me if I'm wrong, but sometimes there's a third language.
Yes.
They don't necessarily do the literary aspect of that language, but they pick it up in terms of the home village or talking to people. So it's not unusual for someone in Pakistan to grow up with. I mean, I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, it varies, but generally speaking, you'll have a lot of people in Pakistan, especially in urban areas, who grow up speaking Urdu and English equally well, and then have some facility in a third language.
In rural areas, I think they pick up their language, the local language first. I feel like it's the national policies as well. I feel like Urdu is sort of forced upon people when really the connection that they feel with their local language cannot be replaced. And with English, we have a long history of colonization, so that's just a different aspect. But I think our local languages do play a huge role. In our day-to-day life, and we do pick them up before. As a student of linguistics and language acquisition, we do see how local languages are often prioritized, especially in rural settings. Right.
No, and it is interesting. I mean, Pakistan is a country of so many languages, and it complicates things, but one might also say it enriches things as well.
So you had a lot of colleagues who, I believe, if I've got this right, they worked in language preservation and just really were involved in works related to language and culture. Like, for example, you had that colleague who took up Pashto, and then your father himself was doing work for Sindhi. How would you say that your early experiences of, the cultural immersion that you perhaps got through your experiences in Pakistan, living in Pakistan in different areas, how has that led you to implement such strategies in FC? I'm sure there was a vision. I'm sure there is still a vision. So how do you think these things are related?
Yeah, I mean, I feel, to be completely honest, I think what the gift of my childhood, if you will, was more at ease in different cultures more than different languages, because I haven't mastered. I mean, Urdu and Hindi, I get around very well. My wife is from Scotland, and by the way, the project is about preserving languages. I mean, her father grew up speaking Gaelic, and Gaelic in the west coast of Scotland, and even in the whole country, was really discouraged. Actually, it was in the north of Scotland where he lived, and so that was part of it. Fiona grew up with. I mean, she grew up French and German, and I mean, her skills are better than mine. We always used to say that Jonathan will get us by in India and Pakistan and Dubai, the Gulf, because you can, the taxi, you can use those languages there as well. So that's, as a family, we have 3 kids. That was my responsibility, were those 3 parts of the world. And of course, as a diplomat, we traveled in many places. We lived in Mongolia, we lived in Jordan, we lived in Yemen, we lived in Kazakhstan. So she would say not fluent in any language, but she was the one that would go out to the shops and bazaars, so she had to learn the numbers quickly, and especially in a place like Kazakhstan where English was not spoken much, Yemen as well. So, you can see I admire my wife, because I think that she picked up again not fluency in terms of intellectual fluency, but at ease in a country where you're able to do the greetings and the shopping and stuff like that. So I mean, her list includes Arabic, Mongolian, Russian, a bit of Afrikaans, because we were in South Africa for 3 years, and even when we traveled in Europe, her high school French and German has got us good mileage. So I think what I'm at ease at is the crossing boundaries of culture, language. Again, those guys I mentioned, it was a small school. In any case, it only had 30 or 40 kids in high school. But the examples I've given were more the exceptions that I admire than the general thing. Some people went out of that school hardly speaking a word of Urdu. Some people, my parents brought me to Pakistan. Why did that? And they haven't been back in decades, or they've never been back. And so it was like a childhood episode, which must surely be a childhood memory. For me, I've come back on different occasions. I came back to do a certain amount of study at university. I did my dissertation on economic impact of migration from Pakistan to the Middle East, which, your family, that was part of your family history perhaps. And then I came in, when I joined the Foreign Service, I had 2 assignments. One was my first assignment back in Pakistan. And then I had after the earthquake, I was the USA Admission Director and, involved in travel in the northern areas and stuff like that. When I came back as a university student, I was sort of a bit sheepish and embarrassed that I didn't speak Urdu as well as I should. So I did some self-study. I also studied Arabic, now that I think about it. And that I already knew how to read the script, but that consolidated the script. I don't read Urdu freely, but at the same time, I don't have any problem, reading, feeling at home with the signs, and I can struggle through a poem or something like that. But still, being able to read the script, I think. That's one thing. Again, the project's about languages. There's the spoken part. On the written front, I guess the scripts I know are the English script, the Russian Cyrillic script, and the Arabic script. And that gets you to different places because there's other languages that are written in Cyrillic, and there's other languages that use the Arabic script. And just as you explore the world and as you feel free in the world, I think it's useful to have that. And some languages, people are good that you're trying and they forgive your mistakes. Some languages, a mistake is sort of unforgivable. Yes. And I think it's obviously you prefer the ones where they're more forgiving. And I think Pakistan's in that category, by the way. I think that people appreciate it, appreciate the effort. So that's part of it. Foreman is really interesting because think about it. Between last week and I guess, is it tomorrow night or the night? And after we have Saraiki night here.
So we just had the Gilgit night
exactly,
as well.
Exactly. So we have 3 different nights here. We have the Pashto night, we have the Saraiki night, and we have the Gilgit, the Baltistan Chitral night. Now, the interesting thing is that the northern areas probably has more languages than any other place in Pakistan. That it's, such a mix of different languages. And, again, I always say that those students from all those areas and from everywhere in this country enrich our community and so it's really good. I think you can discuss about English and legacy of colonialism, I suppose, is one aspect of it, although English it wasn't always a colonial language, but I think it was resilient because I want to say it wasn't always a colonial language. It goes back many years, and there's been colonial
it
epics.
has its unique history.
It has unique history sort of separate from that. Again, the accidents of history, maybe French would be spoken more widely, or even German. The Germans sort of arrived late, and they didn't forge an empire like the people before them, or even Italian or whatever. But anyway, English, obviously the 1800s was ironically, when the British lost their North American empire, they turned their attention to Asia and built their Asian empire. Africa was even, I suppose, a little bit later, but but it is what it is. It is an international language, and I think that it's an advantage that people from Pakistan actually have. If you study in the States or Europe or anywhere else, your students from South Asia are very likely to speak English better than anybody else in the classroom, or any of the other international students in the classroom. And of course, it's the language of instruction at Foreman, but it's not just Foreman, it's the university language of instruction quite broadly. And so, again, in terms, I guess the markers for me are certainly partly the language, but they're also the cultural markers. And there's also the recognition that, obviously it varies to extent, but and I hate to use the cliche, diversity or whatever, but it's diversity, and it's not just, because of its heritage or origins and, the Presbyterian Church and all that. It's partly a religious diversity that's here, but that's not and the diversity is, the Pakistan Christian Church has every stripe of Christianity. The Muslim community in Foreman has, the different diversity within the religion, but you have religious diversity. But beyond that, you have the linguistic diversity you're talking about. You have the geographic diversity from KPP or
and all of these are tied with one another.
Yeah, and then you have the socioeconomic diversity, which I think is one thing that I'm proud of. I think looking back at my own grew up in Pakistan. The missionary families tend not to be from the elite of the country, and I benefited from scholarships when I went back to the States for my higher education. And I think that we do provide also opportunities in terms of socioeconomic diversity. That's also, this is 4 years that people have to meet people different than themselves, and I think that's what we work toward, and that we honor in this
I think
institution.
the students here really appreciate that aspect of FC as well. That's one of the most favorite points you ask anyone on campus, and that's something that will come up in the conversation that you have with them. You shared a lot of your experiences as a diplomat, and then your just work experience, upbringing. So you must know a lot of languages. You've mentioned a couple of scripts as well. So as a multilingual, how do you navigate those language dynamics, especially in a country like Pakistan? Just generally as a multilingual, how do you navigate those dynamics? How do you pick and choose between languages, and especially in Pakistan, and then in FC as well, where we have both native speakers of English as well, and then local speakers of languages who might struggle with Urdu as well, and then proper people like me who've probably lived abroad and then shifted back here. There's diversity in that aspect as well.
Right.
So in these three levels, globally, in Pakistan, and then just in FC, how do you navigate these language dynamics? Right.
Well, like I said, there's different ways one does it. As a family, I mentioned that my wife, I studied those languages. You'll meet Foreign Service officers who say, I speak 6 languages or whatever. I don't necessarily believe them, because taking a course in a language doesn't give you, certainly doesn't give you fluency. So, I think my Urdu and Hindi, I feel a high degree of comfort level in India, Pakistan, and the Gulf. Because I can speak it, and I can do what needs to be done. The other languages that I've studied, it's not at that level. Fiona does a better job of it, and although she would say I'm not, and she's not fluent, but she even in terms of functioning. In Pakistan, I guess I will say that one of the delights of coming back was the realization that I can retrieve my Urdu even if I haven't spoken it in many years, and that I can get around, and it gives me sort of psychic satisfaction, especially when I understand conversations that people think that I'm not understanding, because they look and think, this guy doesn't speak English. I did that a few times in Chicago. I went to Northwestern for my undergraduate, and I'd be sitting in a subway, and someone, not necessarily from Pakistan, maybe from India, they would be thinking they're having their secret language or whatever, and they're talking to each other, and and at the end I might have a little, talk to them and say, sort of imply to them that I knew more about your conversation than you might realize. So, that's sort of, a fun aspect, I suppose. I do think it's a plus. I'm self-conscious about my accent, and I don't necessarily think it's great, but you heard my little few words there. I think, some people say that it's not bad as an accent. It doesn't sound as awful as some of the foreigners speaking it. It's interesting, my own kids, because they had my childhood was always in Pakistan. Their childhood was 2 years here and 3 years there, and moving from place to place, so much so that they didn't really master any language, although now Cameron, our second son in particular, we were in Cambodia, he'd do Khmer. When we were in Kazakhstan, they went to Russian Detsky Sat kindergarten. So that's another example of what your project's about, is both our boys went into Kazakhstan is Kazakhstan, but a lot of the education, like in Pakistan, is in a different language, Russian. And so we just, put them in the Russian kindergarten. So it's kind of like sink or swim. So years later, when, we have it on video that they once upon a time spoke Russian, but of course they lost it after the age of 6 and went to, 5 other countries or whatever. But we have it on video. But when he traveled through, he did a Mongol rally from Paris to Ulaanbaatar, and they went through Kazakhstan, and in Mongolia they speak Russian as well. And his accent was pretty good, and he did a little bit of self-teaching, and he was the one that, this was 4 of his college friends were taking this old beat-up car across, and, having been exposed to the language in kindergarten, all those years later, he was able to reach back and retrieve at least the pronunciation part. And he's, of the kids, he's probably the one that experiments and doesn't mind making mistakes, and
that's how we learn.
Try. That's how we learn. Yeah. I think he's probably. I'm too self-conscious. That's probably why someone like Joel or Paul Stock, they just spoke it. And if you're more self-conscious like me, then you're not just speaking it. You're afraid of making mistakes, and then you don't learn it as well. So.
Do you think the environment at FC now, according, I keep using the word diversity, but I don't have a better word
Yeah,
to
no,
explain this.
I mean, the reason why I say is that they have a sort of an American lens to look at it. I think that we are part of a diverse community in a different kind of way, but I haven't come up with a better word either.
So like the environment that we have here, a lot of like when I shifted to Pakistan, I struggled with Urdu as well because, and especially Punjabi, because I don't understand Punjabi at all. So when I come on campus and in classes I hear like, they're like, oh, your ethnicity is Punjabi, you must understand Punjabi.
Right,
I'm like,
right.
no, not really.
Yeah.
But I found it easier to pick that language up in FC because a lot of us are learning languages simultaneously, and then we all have our own journey of discovering our own mother tongues, even if we're shifted from abroad, or parts of ourselves like local languages that weren't taught at home, and we're now rediscovering them through the environment at FC. So do you think the multilingual community at FC has contributed to language preservation in any way?
Actually, that's a good point. And the longer I'm here, I've met not a lot, but I've met a handful of students in your category that grew up in the Middle East, and or the Gulf or whatever, and I love to see that. I don't know your own story about coming to Foreman, but I love to think that there's maybe families are comfortable here. I met one other person who said that their teacher, I think this was in Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, was a Foremanite, and had said, "Oh, why don't you consider going to Foreman?" I think, if I'm not mistaken, his mother might have been from Russia or Tajikistan or something. So I love the fact, I mean, in the 60s, if you look at Foreman, they had, for example, they had African students here. And, so we don't have that visible international presence, but I think that, I tell my friends when they come to Lahore that, that what they see is when they get off at the airport, a crowded airport, and, you step out there, and it's just, wow, welcome to Lahore, welcome to Pakistan. I said, everybody you see there is far more connected than you realize with the diaspora, if you will, with the UK, with Australia, with the Gulf, with the US, with Canada, whatever. So I mean, that's part of it, is that they're far more connected. But I think you're right. I mean, someone would maybe look at you and say, "Oh, your Urdu must be fantastic," or "Of course she speaks Punjabi," or whatever, and yet you're learning like other people are learning as well. And I think, I guess I would partly attribute that to the what we try to cultivate, and I know none of us live up to our ideals, but what we try to cultivate is this sort of honoring people and respecting people where they are. And, if you're in an environment where someone's apt to be ridiculed or made fun of or whatever, then you don't have room for that kind of experimentation. And again, I guess people sometimes think I'm an idealist, but I think we do have an atmosphere that, we welcome the differences, and we welcome multiple voices, and that multiple voices, that just as it implies, is language that you're talking about. And I realize we're mostly in English. I mean, again, thinking of kind of examples. Jim Tebby, my predecessor, I think was better at Urdu than I was. He could preach a sermon in Urdu, which I can't do, and he had formally studied it. But his thing, which we still keep to some extent, is we have a sort of end of the week staff meeting, and probably not as much as when he was there, but we go back and forth between English and Urdu, and I understand pretty much all the Urdu they're talking about, and sometimes I'll be in Urdu, more often I'll be in English. But I think, I mean, this is kind of another unique aspect. It happens in Pakistan in different ways, but certainly it wouldn't happen too often in the States, is that people are having conversations that go back and forth. And I think that's great. The linguists would study this, but I would imagine that there's certain conversations that lend themselves to Urdu better, and there's certain conversations that lend themselves to English better. So we get this wonderful mix of going back and forth. And I think that's a strength.
In psycholinguistics, we do study this. You do feel more connected, and you can't have those conversations in another language.
Yes,
you need to feel at home with the language. When we're talking about this, I just wanted to, you've mentioned weekly meetings, and I'm sure you meet the faculty as well. And you must have seen them interacting with each other, and there must be a difference in the way the speakers of the language interact between themselves and then with you. Do you feel that difference, and how do you go about it then?
Well, it's there. I mean, I haven't analyzed it so much, but I appreciated it. One of the things that this is a good candid conversation, and it's not so much internally to Foreman, but I'll be at an audience outside Foreman, And I guess I'm aware of some of the differences or whatever, and so it's clear that they want to have a conversation in Urdu, or that they're talking Urdu because they gravitate toward there naturally, and then says, oh, we got to talk in English because there's somebody here that doesn't understand it, and I get pretty self-conscious about that, and I would say would you do it or whatever. I'd like people to know that I don't want them to speak in English because of me. I mean, even if I didn't understand it, they should speak in Urdu. But I like to convey to them somehow that I speak Urdu. You don't have to revert to English out of courtesy to the seeming Pardesi log that's in
and
your class.
And plus, it would assist your language learning journey as well. If they spoke in Urdu with you, you would then become a better Urdu speaker and just feel more immersed as well.
Yeah. No, I think that's part. I mean, my wife in particular, when she came out, and again, I said she's better at languages than me. Is that, I mean, this highlights the relationships and the unequal relationships or whatever. But she was studying Urdu, and her Urdu teacher would say, "Go back home and practice the language." And so she would try to practice the language, and the Urdu teacher would say, you make you'd look at the ceiling and you'd say, or you look at the floor and you'd say, ye chatha, or this is the roof or whatever, and your household help was supposed to correct you, but in this social structure they don't correct it. And
sometimes they'll even adopt what you're saying just to fit in better.
Exactly. And so, I mean, this is a cultural, I mean, she's observed this from time to time and thinks it was a handicap for her. Then she'd she was teaching Islamabad at the British school, so she'd go to the covered market and she'd say, mujhe chhe seb chahiye. And the guy would say, oh, you want 6 apples? And so, there was no way that she was going to learn Urdu because the shop guy would come back in English. And so it just wasn't an environment that lent itself to trying to acquire a language. So.
And also, just coming back to Urdu, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions about maybe any memorable event, cultural event, maybe a wedding or a birth ceremony as we have in Pakistan often. During your stay here, have you attended any event? And during those events, what do you think, how big of a role do you think language plays? And how does that impact you as a multilingual speaker?
So, my setup was 3 months of a vacation in Sindh, which was basically December, January, February, and then 9 months in school in Murray in boarding school. And so the Sindh part was interesting because our parents we traveled to the, Mojadaro and Kotiji. This was Upper Sindh. And I mean, even they used to have an eye hospital from Quetta, and this was the Fazldin family that we got to know quite well. And I appreciate this aspect about my parents is that they, we just went up to Quetta. We were probably 12 years old with the Fazldin family, and we were just kids, and so that provided more of a Urdu kind of environment, and so that part was good. I think, another interesting cultural observation is that. Probably weddings more than anything were the cultural event that we're invited to in Shikarpur or neighboring towns or villages. The one thing about, and again, this is just at that time, maybe it would be the case right now, but I think, as foreigners, if you will, or visibly foreigners, you have pluses and minuses, but perhaps one of the pluses is that we were able to gravitate toward different groups,
Different groups
wealthy, wealthy family, landlord, poor family, tenant labor, Christian family in the basti. I mean, because we weren't readily situated in the society, we could sometimes, have these kinds of things. So when I say weddings, and basically it was different types of weddings. Up until about, and this is conservative Upper Sindh, up until about 12 years old, we would be with my mother on the mother's side of the wedding, and then as we got older, we would be on my father's side of the wedding. So I think it was probably more cultural insights than linguistic insights. My father, I think, was again, if it was Sindhi or even in Urdu, because he learned that as another language, it was pretty able to talk. I used Urdu. I heard Urdu. I did not use Sindhi. I heard Sindhi, but again, I think it was more, if you can say this, and maybe this is a cop out, but it was more cultural fluency than linguistic fluency. So I understood, the festivals and Ramadan and Qurbani and Eid and all that kind of thing. So I think there was a high degree of cultural fluency that didn't translate for me. Because of the setting so much into linguistic fluency.
And sometimes, for example, I don't know if this is a common observation with other people, but staying in Lahore, I've noticed that, for example, in weddings, you know, the niqab part where they're taking their vows, it's in Urdu. And then the songs that will play in the background is their local language. So in terms of that, you end up picking up these little things, especially maybe because I'm studying linguistics. But these differences, I was wondering if you were ever able to pick up these differences as a person who didn't speak those languages or wasn't as accustomed to those languages. Did you ever notice such
well, I'm not so sure a foreigner coming here can distinguish among Urdu, Punjabi, Sindhi, but I know immediately. I mean, and that's, you know, maybe that is a kind of, you know, cultural acquaintance. I know immediately, or Pashto for that matter. I mean, it's you know, they're distinctly different. Although a foreigner coming from Pakistan the first time,
will think they're the same language.
They might think it's the same language. So that's you know, that's an interesting thought. We haven't talked so much about music. I mean, I mean, the Punjabi I know is, again, you know, the origins of the Christian community here, and the Zabur, the Punjabi songs. I mean, they're beautiful. I don't know if you've ever heard them, but that's sort of the quintessential, you know, Punjabi to music kind of thing. And so I wasn't exposed so much to Punjabi, but you know, the Punjabis from the Christian community I met, that language resonated with them, and so I heard Punjabi in that context. But you know, I guess I did hear the different languages. The only one I used myself was Urdu. I mean, a little smattering of Sindhi, but not really. It was, for me, the Urdu was the second language, and it did allow me to, on trains and this kind of thing, to get around Pakistan, and it was good. I mean, it was a plus that I was appreciative of.
Apart from music that you've just mentioned, are there any other oral traditions, a tradition that is maybe meaningful to you? Like ghazals, for example, poems that you might have heard, or quotes, shairi is very popular in Pakistan, or even just anything from songs as well, old songs. Any meaningful or ancient oral tradition that you, even national anthems, like I'm just trying to give as many examples as I can, but something that is particularly meaningful to you, an oral tradition of that sort. Could you just let us know? Yeah,
no, I mean, I gravitate toward Paksa Zamin Shadbad. You know, I mean, that you know, it stirs my heart in some ways. There's some wonderful, of course, patriotic Pakistani songs, you know, Dil Dil Pakistan, and actually Tumhara Vatan Hai. I mean, that's probably my favorite. Or Nasr Fateh Ali Khan, Wohi Khuda Hai. I mean, that to me is just like, this is getting into Qawwali, I guess, but and of course I love it. I don't go as often as I would like to because of other demands, but you know, we have Qawwali concerts here, and they're some of my favorite events. I mean, I just think Qawwali is just fantastic. You know, I think growing up, I'm trying to think what I heard. There were some efforts to introduce us to the broader culture in my, you know, sort of more enclosed, you know, community that I was part of. But some of that interest was spurred more after I left Pakistan. And again, I mean, if we got to talking, you'd have some similarities in, you know, Pakistani growing up in Dubai with, you know, me growing up in Pakistan. So when I left it, I mentioned I was sort of, I thought I should be speaking Urdu better, so I looked up stuff. But I did pick up some books that were, you know, bilingual in the sense that they would have the poem, for example, in English translation, and then they would have the Romanized, and then they would have the script. And there's one in particular, Kiernan's translation of Fez Ahmed Fez, which is beautiful. So I'm a student in Boston, and you know, I see that Fez Ahmed Fez is coming to Boston University, and I go and hear a Fez Ahmed Fez Mashayda. And I mean, I didn't have to. I had left Pakistan a few years ago. I could have said, well, Pakistan was the early part of my life and it's finished. But I was, you know...
Was there some sort of like connection?
There was a connection. There was almost a spiritual connection, I suppose you might say. And so that connection, you know, if there was an event taking place, you know, probably a couple of my, you know, Cubby Cubby, everybody around here knows, mixes with me, knows that Cubby Cubby is one of my, you know, favorite songs, and the movie as well is you know,
Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gham, is that
Kabhi Kabhi, Mere Dil Mein, how does it go? It's just the refrain is Kabhi Kabhi. Boy, I'm just blanking right now in this context, but it's Kabhi Kabhi Dil Mein Khayal Aata Hai. You know, that comes to me, and I mean, it's actually. I mean, I wish I could recite the thing. I've actually, speaking about this. at each of our kids, well, our 2 or 3 kids are married, and the night before you have a sort of rehearsal dinner with the other family and stuff like that. I've recited that. It's if the English translation here is something like "Kabhi kabhi," from time to time the thought enters my heart that we were made for each other, that you were made just for me, that you were a star in heaven and you came down to earth just for me. I don't know if this is familiar with you or not, but
I will go and look this up.
It's a Amitabh Bachchan movie.
Oh.
So Kabhi Kabhi.
So Bollywood, right?
It's a Bollywood, yeah.
I'm not that familiar with Bollywood.
But so what this is, though, I mean, what's interesting, I'm trying to piece it together here, but it's sort of a hopeless poet in love, and actually this is a poet from the Muslim community in India that wrote this. He's wrote a lot of wonderful poems. I forget the name, but if you look up Kabhi Kabhi and Amitabh Bachchan and you listen to the song, I think you'll agree with me that's a great song.
I'll connect the dots.
Of course, part of this is generational because this is an earlier generation. But I heard actually one of our at the college. I saw it on YouTube. One of our college teachers, I think he's studying for his PhD in University of Punjab. He was teaching a student Kya Hua Theravada, and have you heard of Kya Hua Theravada? So these are my 2 favorite songs. So
I will look them up.
Kya Hua, what happened to your promises? And they're beautiful songs. And I've really gravitated. So when people ask me, what's your favorite song, I'm apt to say, and again, this is from a previous generation. So you guys are a whole different generation. But I think if it depends on the versions. Some of the versions of Kya Hua Theravada are kind of disappointing to me. But this guy, was it Suleiman? I forget his name. Anyway, he was playing on the harmonium and he was singing the song, and it was just like, whoa, that's really fantastic. So, those ones. Faiz Ahmad Faiz is great. I mean, I've read a lot of his work over the years, and it's just beautiful. I just think he's certainly a world cultural figure and impact on Urdu. I don't know. Do young people read Faiz Ahmad Faiz nowadays? Or
yes, it's still I think popular, he's an icon for us still.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think beautiful. I mean, that's Urdu poetry at its best, I think. And I think I know enough to appreciate it. I think I can read the Urdu enough to appreciate that aspect, and then I look at the translation, and sometimes I think, that's translation is not as good as it should be or whatever. But it's beautiful.
But you can pick that up. That the translation isn't.
That they might have missed something or whatever. I mean, the irony is that Kiernan again is a very interesting British translator of Faiz Ahmad Faiz, and one of the poems they have a literal translation and they have his literary translation, and in a couple of the cases, the literal translation is better than the literary translation, because the literary translation is trying to get to. I don't know. He's trying to read too much into the text, whereas what's beautiful is the.
And I think you need to have some sort of connection where you've actually spent time in the cultural context to better understand things. It needs to come from an insider's perspective, and that might be missing in some cases. What about shows? So Pakistani dramas.
The heyday of PTV, which I don't. Did you grow up listening to some of those TV shows in the? I mean, when you grew up, was internet there? I mean, are all your memories associated with internet, or maybe not so much?
Yes.
So again, that shows the generational thing, because I was sort of pre-internet, and PTV, that was the the heyday of PTV. Now, my recollection, and again, this is really dates me, is that it was in the 1960s that television came into Pakistan, and we did not have a television. I mean, then it was sort of unusual. So I mean, I talk about technology. I mean, I grew up without a telephone or a television, and that was Pakistan in the 60s. I mean, more urban, upper class families probably had them, but I didn't grow up with television. It was pre-cell phone, so if you had we didn't have a phone in our house. I mean, it wasn't part of my childhood, and television wasn't part either. But I remember going from Murray, where I went to school, just spend the day in Pindi or whatever, and the Silver Grill, they had a television, so we saw those. This will be a copywriter's dream for the advertising industry, that there are a couple. I don't remember the shows. I remember the commercials. So the commercial was the Lipton's tea, chai chai ye, kwan si janab, Lipton's lijiye, Lipton's DGA, whatever. I mean, to think that after all these years, it was such a catchy tune. You're familiar with that tune also?
Yes, I think they're still using it.
I think what I was going to say, I'm guessing it started in the early 70s, but whichever copywriter wrote that is brilliant. People are still singing his, chai chai ye, kwan si janab all those years later. There was also a very dramatic commercial of ever-ready batteries. Of course, this is all in order to is, the guys are sleeping outside in the grass like we did in Chicago. We slept on the roof in the hot weather or on the front lawn or something. And, there's a dramatic scene where there's a cobra underneath the bed. I don't know if they even play this one, but it was a brilliant advertisement. He pulls off the flashlight and, sees the cobra. And, of course, he's got ever-ready batteries. The poor guy next door that doesn't have ever-ready batteries, the light doesn't come on, so it's a commercial. And, I guess the question was about TV shows. And I know there were some good TV shows, but it's funny that after all these years, it's more the advertisements that I remember than the shows.
I think it's even true currently. A lot of people tend to remember advertisements. They're developed in a way so that they're more catchy and they stay in your memory. One of my majors is psychology, so we study in consumer psychology how advertisements are made to be so. So I would understand that aspect. Do you, maybe, when maybe faculty members are discussing in their free time or something, some form of media, like some shows or movies, do you end up catching those, or are you recommended something to watch?
Well, I think, this is actually a very good question, and of course it's, across cultures as well. I think I catch on to, because of growing up in Pakistan, I think I do catch on to some of the childhood markers that are rooted in Pakistan. Of course, the faculty, our faculty is, I guess, our vice rector counted once that there's 21, our faculty have advanced degrees from 21 countries. So we have a handful of foreign faculty from, Portugal and Netherlands and Australia and the US or whatever. But what also enriches this international perspective at this institution is that our faculty from Pakistan, if you will, have advanced degrees from 21 countries. So someone like Dr. Althoff brings that German perspective or whatever. And I think, maybe it's because some of these are global markers, but I think some of our faculty do, connect with U.S., Hollywood, or, kinds of references as well. I felt when I went, because I grew up in a family that didn't really go to the movies and stuff like that, I felt when I went to the States at age 18 for university that there were things in the culture that I missed that were cultural markers because they had grown up watching television or they had seen, The Graduate was one famous film that came out in the 60s, and, that was a cultural, kind of film that had cultural impact. And I wasn't aware of those cultural references myself. And so, but I think over the coming years, I began to learn them. So I feel at ease there. To some extent in the UK, I don't know the cultural references and things like, Germany and France or whatever, but I do know the UK. And of course, my wife being from Scotland, I've been, introduced to this Scottish humor, the Scottish cultural markers as well.
Coming toward the language documentation project, what are your thoughts on the project, and what do you think we can accomplish through this project that would be meaningful to the FCCU community? And then I would move on to FC as a whole in terms of its diversity.
So I may be missing out, and there may be a couple of projects that I'm not aware of, and so you'll have to excuse my ignorance. But my first understanding is that there were some oral histories going on related to partition in 47. And of course, this is the last moment to capture those because that generation is disappearing from the stage, as it were, disappearing from the scene. So I thought of it. I thought of it more in the context of the 47 generation, or Freedom at Midnight, or Born at Midnight, or something like that. So the language part is something that was introduced to me more recently. But I think it's a brilliant idea, and I think Pakistan as a setting to discuss these issues is also amazing, and especially for linguists that grow up in a more mono-linguistic kind of environment. They must be amazed when they come at Pakistan and see all these ones. There is the issue that you've talked about the smaller cultures, if you will. A little bit aware of that from, again, my wife's experience with Gaelic. I mean, most people outside Pakistan or outside Scotland wouldn't know the contours of that linguistic landscape, but there's the difference. Of course, the accents in the UK are pretty remarkable when you think about it. I think that's disappearing. I guess we're talking more about linguistics than accents, but the fact that the UK used to have so many accents, and I think those are
Now
being crowded out. Yeah. So Pakistan
That's the
is
same with
interesting.
Pakistan as well. We had a lot of local languages to start with. A lot of them are so endangered. Like one of the languages, Badeshi, there's only 3 speakers in Pakistan now.
Wow.
So, and especially with accents as well, varieties and dialects, we're experiencing the same thing as well.
I mean, some people would say, it's almost like you're losing a universe or you're losing a civilization when you lose a language because of the importance of language. I think there's the writer Saul Bellow that said that, looking at an old man, he said nobody has any idea what lies buried within the dome of his skull, because when he passes, when this old person that he's observing passes away, there are some things that are lost forever. So.
That is actually a very beautiful saying.
Yeah, no, I wish I could capture it. I don't know if I don't even know if it's in Book of Quotations or whatever, but I just remember when I came across this, I thought, wow, what a way to, describe the, older person that you look at and you think, their life is finished. What's the big deal about that? Or, you don't appreciate or have empathy for them, but you think about the things their eyes have seen and the thoughts that are buried in that domed head.
And just lastly, what do you think we can do in FC to preserve languages? We have language courses. Something that pops up in my head is that we have language courses, but we have language courses for foreign languages. What if we were to introduce language courses for local languages? Or what comes in your mind when you think about preserving languages on the campus?
Yeah, no, that's a good one. I mean, we've mentioned this before, but well, Punjabi, I think people take for granted because we live in Punjab or whatever, and I don't know, maybe Punjabi's in a separate category, but I also think it, and I think that I'm not sure, but I mean, I guess is that people in Punjab think that sometimes Punjabi doesn't get the recognition that it deserves, or maybe, and again, I'm just speculating here, but sometimes. I don't know, this is probably putting it too strongly, but some people in Punjab may think we've sacrificed our language for Pakistan because we learned Urdu, and whereas in Sindhi and Pashto they maybe resisted that more or something like that. Saraiki is an interesting case in point because it's within Punjab, but it's a distinctive.
And they're fighting for it to be recognized as a separate language.
Exactly. Probably that's one of the more interesting issues, and I, in my role, I have to be ambivalent, just dispassionate, which means if you're a Saraiki speaker, you'll be very passionate for the cause. I have to sort of look at it in the context, and that's the way it should be. I shouldn't, it's just a cultural phenomenon that's unfolding. Although you can really appreciate one's affinity and desire to save one's language, so that's part of the mix. We don't have much of a Sindhi presence here. We have a handful of professors that would have that Sindhi aspect. I don't know if you knew Parkash Singh, who was one of our Sikh students here.
Parkash, yes.
Parkash, yeah, I think he's on his way to the States. I always thought he was one of the first people I met, and I was surprised when I found out he was from Sucker. So, what's interesting now that I'm thinking about it is the Sikh community in Sindh knows Sindhi. The Sikh community in PKK knows Pashto. The Sikh community in Punjab knows Punjabi. So, you got to admire that community that they've adjusted to the different, geographical places where they've been. But he, when I grew up in Upper Sindh, he was born in Shikarpur of all places. I was not aware of small as it was. I was not aware of a Sikh community there, and I'm less aware of the Sindhi presence. Saraiki, we have a flow of students from southern Punjab, so I've become aware of that, and certainly KPP in the northern areas. Those three ones are what's reflective of the most active student communities that that have their cultural nights. I appreciate the fact, and I don't. My sense is, we all have our own, place in the community here. But my sense is that they welcome people from all the communities to come to the nights, and I think that's one of the strengths of Foreman is that, the Gilgit the Gilgit Tritral and Baltistan night is also a chance for outreach to show the rest of the world this wonderful traditions that they have. So we provide that kind of space. Somebody sent me an email. A student sent me an email saying, "Why don't we have kabaddi on campus?" Fair enough. That's a good question. I think that our sports people may be working on, developing a kabaddi tournament.
And it's really interesting to see how the students are coming up with their own ways of bringing. It's like they've been given an opportunity to express their cultural identities, and then now they're trying to give back to the community. Even for this project, the students, we didn't have a hard time looking for local speakers on campus. Even though there's like one or two speakers from each language community, they're that eager to contribute to the preservation of their language and just the expression of that language and culture on campus. So
well, I think this project is helpful there as well. I mean, I guess I would just say that, and from my perspective, very open to those kinds of suggestions. You hate to bring up the cost factor, but the reality is that, if you had a class and you only had 5 or 6 people, it would be harder to maintain it. But in principle, I think it's a good idea, and I think we'd want to be welcoming to that kind of thing.
And those are all the questions that I have. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about?
No, I mentioned before, I think I mentioned to Adil Khalid that I thought the questions were great. I thought he came up with them, but he gave you credit. He said that you came up with them. And I've been a little bit of time scheduling it because in this, I'm leaving our son's getting married, so I'm leaving on the 11th. So it's a very crowded schedule, but I'm very appreciative. It's a great project. It lets me know a little bit more about it. At first, I thought that I'm the wrong person because, you're looking for people that are truly bilingual, and I don't fall in that category. But I guess in the project, you're looking, even on the fringes or the edges of different kind of encounters with multiple languages. Maybe that's the point of the whole exercise. So the whole
aspect of multilingualism and just people speaking different languages and how well they can accustom to the local languages here, that's also something. If you have a unique history with the local languages, you would be meaningful to the project because you can contribute to something. Even maybe not to the language documentation aspect of it, not the language itself, but the ideas behind language. The experiences that would lead researchers to develop better policies, because once you document a language, there's research conducted on that documented language. And the ideas, because we ask the local speakers, how do you think we can preserve your language? And they have brilliant ideas. So to get a very diverse set of responses, it's always good to interview as many people as you can, those who have some sort of exposure with the languages as well. And I'm so thankful, and I'm sure Saradil would agree, that we're constantly emailing you in your busy schedule, but thank you so much for taking out time for this and for providing such. I had a really lovely time conducting this interview. I learned a lot, not just about you, but also about the languages, and it has been really insightful, and your insights are just invaluable. So thank you so much.
No, I appreciate it a lot. One quick question for you, I guess, is were you able to pick up Arabic in the Middle East, or what happens? I mean, if there's any, talk about international environment, Dubai and Abu Dhabi and the Gulf. Talk about the meeting place of the world. They got people from everywhere there, and my assumption would be it would not have been that easy to pick up Arabic.
So they teach it. They teach it in our when I was studying there till O levels. They used to teach it as a subject. Usually, people in Pakistan, if they're studying O levels, they would have 8 subjects. I had 12 subjects over there, and 2 of those were related to the country. So I had 3 of them. In fact, I had history and geography related to the Gulf. Then I had Tarbiyya Islamiyya, which is Islamia, about the religion, but in Arabic.
Oh, wow.
And that Arabic was very, very easy. So it would have translations. And they would have translations at the side too. So we were not essentially learning Arabic through the course. And it was a repetition of what we were learning in Islamia. And we had Arabic, but we had non-mother tongue Arabic. So it was really easy, really easy. So the basic grammar I can pick up, reading and just some words, I could pick those up. But I feel like if we study proper Arabic, like the Arabic that the natives, that they were being taught, we would have been able to, I think, maintain it better, because I can speak Arabic, I can read it too, but if I have to speak with a native speaker, it's like I forget everything.
No, that's sometimes that happens with me, who do as well, quite honestly. But anyway,
when I shifted here, it was pretty strong. I've been here for 5 years now, so it has gone.
Yeah. No, that's actually why I was relieved when I came back after Pakistan for many years away, that in the deeper recesses of my brain, I still was able to remember some of it after all these years. So anyway, no, great. And, all the best, whatever comes next. And I guess you've got one more semester after this is what it is. Hopefully you'll begin to use the campus center.